When my neighbors cut down my trees and poured concrete across my driveway, I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. But then I heard the words that burned into me. "Too bad, old man. It's ours now." That was the moment everything changed. For 2 months, I played the part of a quiet, powerless man, while I set a trap so perfect that when the sheriff finally arrived, it wasn't my house on the line. It was theirs. Before we continue, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your neighbors tried to steal your land like this? I never thought I'd live long enough to see my land become the center of a war. For 30 years, this property was my safe haven. 3 acres of oak trees, rolling grass, and a house I'd built with my own 2 hands back when my knees still had spring in them. Every board, every nail carried a memory. Maria and I had raised our kids here. We'd buried 2 beloved dogs under the tall oaks near the fence line. I'd planted those trees myself when we first moved in. By the time I reached retirement, they'd grown thick and strong, shading the yard with a canopy that felt like family. Life had grown quieter after Maria passed. The kids lived hours away, busy with jobs and families of their own. That didn't bother me much. The land kept me company. I kept busy tending the garden, fixing what needed fixing, and watching the seasons change across my property line. The neighbors to the west were good folks, retired teachers who respected boundaries. To the east was an empty lot, overgrown but harmless. For years, the quiet was my comfort, until the Jenkins family arrived. They came one spring morning with moving trucks that blocked the narrow country road. At first, I told myself to welcome them like I'd want to be welcomed. The father, Greg Jenkins, was in his 40s, a barrel-chested man with a voice too loud for the quiet country. His wife, Tammy, wore sunglasses even in the shade and carried herself like the world owed her something. They had 2 teenage boys, both built like linebackers, both quick with a smirk. I introduced myself the first day, offering a handshake and a smile. Greg's grip was strong, his grin wider than necessary. "Nice spread you got here," he said, his eyes already wandering past me to my land. I should have recognized it then, the way his gaze lingered on the oaks that shaded my driveway, the wide patch of grass that sloped toward his lot. But I wanted to believe the best. I even helped them unload a few heavy boxes that day, ignoring the way Greg barked orders at his kids like a drill sergeant. Tammy didn't thank me. She was too busy telling one of the movers not to scratch her dining table. For a while, things seemed normal enough. They waved when passing by, though it always felt more like a formality than friendliness. The trouble began small, so small you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. First, it was their kids, cutting across my yard to chase a basketball, trampling the edge of my garden in the process. I mentioned it politely the first time, and Tammy just laughed. "Boys will be boys," she said, as if that excused everything. Then came the noise. Their party stretched late into the night, music thumping across the quiet hills like a nightclub had been dropped in the middle of farmland. I'd step onto my porch, hoping they'd see me and take the hint. Instead, Greg would raise a beer in my direction and shout, "Loosen up, old man," while his friends roared with laughter. Still, I tried to let it slide. You don't want to be the cranky neighbor, the one everyone whispers about. But each time I looked out at my land, I noticed little changes. One day, a branch from one of my oaks lay on the ground. Saw marks fresh at the cut. Another day, I found empty beer bottles tossed onto my property line like my yard was their trash can. The turning point came in June. I returned from a trip into town to find Greg and his boys standing on my side of the fence with chainsaws. 2 of my oaks were gone, stumps still bleeding sap. The driveway looked naked without them. My heart hammered in my chest as I stormed over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Greg didn't flinch. He leaned on his chainsaw, sweat glistening on his forehead. Those trees were dangerous, leaning over the line. Thought I'd do us both a favor before a storm knocked them down. I pointed at the stumps, the sawdust blowing across my driveway. Those were my trees, on my land. Tammy stepped out from behind him, sipping from a glass of wine like it was Sunday brunch. "Oh, come on, they were ugly anyway. This looks cleaner." I felt my blood pressure rising, but I forced myself to stay steady. You don't touch a man's land without asking. You cross the line. Greg smirked, the kind of smirk that says he's not sorry at all. Lines are funny out here. Hard to tell exactly where one ends and the other begins. I knew that wasn't true. The property markers were clear, little metal stakes driven into the ground when I bought the place. I'd mowed around them for years. But Greg wasn't confused. He was testing me, seeing how much he could take before I pushed back. I told him that if it happened again, I'd call the sheriff. He shrugged like I'd just told him it might rain. As I walked back to my house, I could hear Tammy laughing, her voice high and cruel. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stumps through the window. Maria had loved those oaks. We used to drink coffee under them on summer mornings, the shade keeping us cool as the day heated up. Losing them felt like losing another piece of her. My hands curled into fists, but I reminded myself, patience. Maybe it was just one incident. Maybe they'd back off now. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of machinery. I stepped onto my porch to see Greg's truck parked halfway up my driveway, cement mixer churning. His boys were spreading wet concrete that poured over the edge of my property, widening their driveway into my land. I shouted until my throat hurt, but they didn't stop. Greg just cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled back, "Relax, old man. It's just a couple of feet. Nobody cares. Nobody cares." That was the beginning of the end. I knew then that this wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't going to stop. They weren't just bad neighbors. They were thieves. Thieves bold enough to carve into my land while I stood there watching. And deep down, a cold, steady thought began to take shape. If they thought they could steal from me, then I'd show them what happens when you try to rob an old man who has nothing left to lose. But first, I had to let them believe they were winning. The concrete hardened like a scar across my land. Every time I stepped outside, it mocked me. 2 feet of stolen earth, paved over without permission. A silent reminder that my neighbors didn't see me as someone to respect. They saw me as someone to steamroll. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I'd call the county, file a complaint, maybe force them to rip it up. But life in the country doesn't move fast. Bureaucracy drags its heels, and by the time I reached the right office, the Jenkins had already thrown a barbecue on the new slab. Their guests' cars parked half on my property like it was theirs all along. I remember standing at the edge of my porch that evening. Smoke from their grill drifting across the line, music blaring. Greg spotted me watching. He raised his beer and shouted, "Looks better this way, doesn't it?" His friends laughed, Tammy included. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt, but I said nothing. They mistook my silence for weakness. Within a week, I noticed the fence posts shifting. At first, it was subtle. One post leaning a few inches into my side, then another. I thought maybe the ground had softened after rain. But when I walked the line, I found fresh post holes, dirt still loose. Greg was moving the fence, inch by inch. like a thief too cowardly to snatch the whole wallet at once. I caught him hammering one afternoon. "That's my line you're crossing," I told him. Greg wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, his hammer still raised. "Funny thing, old man. I had the property surveyed years ago, back before we moved in. Fence is actually supposed to be here." I narrowed my eyes. "That's a lie. I've lived here 30 years. The stakes are still in the ground." He smirked. "Stakes get moved. Happens all the time. You probably set them wrong yourself." I felt heat rising in my chest, but I forced my voice low. "You'd better move that fence back before you regret it." Tammy appeared from behind their truck, sunglasses on even though the sky was overcast. She crossed her arms. "Greg, don't waste your breath. He's just bitter he can't keep up with changes. Country's growing, things shift. Get used to it, old man." That word again, old man. They tossed it around like a weapon, meant to cut deeper each time. I stood my ground anyway, staring Greg down until his smirk faded. "This isn't finished," I told him, then turned and walked away. But he was right about one thing. It wasn't finished. By July, the fence had crept nearly 4 feet onto my property. My once straight line now zigzagged like a drunk man's walk. Each time I checked, more of my land was swallowed. When I tried to pull the posts back, I found concrete poured around the bases. He wasn't just moving the fence, he was cementing it in place. The final insult came when I saw him mowing the grass inside the new line, as if it belonged to him. When I shouted across, Greg waved, cheerful as ever. "Just keeping my yard neat." That night, I dug out the deed to my land. The numbers and survey descriptions looked like another language, but I knew the truth was in there. 30 years ago, I'd walked the line with the surveyor. I knew exactly where my property began and ended. The Jenkins weren't confused. They were rewriting the boundaries by force. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was theft. The hostility grew with the heat of summer. Their boys, who once only cut across my yard, now played full games of football on it. My garden beds became trampled mud. When I told them to stay off, Greg shouted from his porch, "Can't keep kids cooped up, old man. World's too small for your precious tomatoes." I tried to stay calm, but each word lodged in me like a thorn. My property was all I had left of Maria. Every inch carried a memory. To see it treated like nothing, like it was disposable, lit a fire I hadn't felt in years. The worst was the day I found spray paint on my shed. Big block letters, "Ours." The word dripped red across the wood like blood. I marched straight to their porch, the paint still fresh on my hands from trying to scrub it. Greg sat in a lawn chair, sipping a beer. Tammy scrolled her phone beside him, indifferent. "Your boys vandalized my shed," I said, voice steady but cold. Greg tilted his head. "Got proof?" "Proof? The paint's still wet." He shrugged. "Kids these days. Could have been anyone." "Anyone?" I stepped closer. "Nobody else lives out here." Tammy finally looked up, smirking behind her sunglasses. "Maybe the universe is trying to tell you something. Maybe it's not really yours anymore." I stared at them both, my pulse pounding in my ears. "That shed's been mine since before you set foot on this land. Touch it again and I'll..." Greg stood, his size towering over me. "You'll what? Call the sheriff? Go ahead. We've got nothing to hide. In fact, maybe I'll call them first. Get a real survey done. Bet it proves half this land is rightfully ours." That was the first time he said it plain, ours. Not just the fence, not just the driveway, my land. And the way he said it, so confident, so smug, told me he wasn't bluffing. He'd already convinced himself it was true. The following week, I started receiving notices in the mail. Greg had filed paperwork at the county claiming the property line was drawn incorrectly years ago. He wanted the records amended, the land shifted into his name. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out like a death sentence. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. He was trying to steal a piece of my life with nothing but bold lies and bureaucratic ink. When I confronted him, he didn't even pretend anymore. He leaned on the fence, beer in hand, and said it clear as day. "Too bad, old man. It's ours now." The words hit me harder than any fist could. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a declaration of war. I didn't answer him that day. I just stared, then turned back toward my house. From behind me, I heard Tammy laugh. What they didn't know was that in my silence, I was already plotting. They thought I was just an old man too weak to fight back. They had no idea I was about to dig up 30 years of proof and bury them with it. The notice from the county sat on my kitchen table like a rattlesnake, coiled and waiting to strike. I must have read the first line 10 times, my eyes tracing the bold black letters that spelled out Greg Jenkins's claim. Property line adjustment request. He'd filed to move the boundary nearly 4 feet into my side, 4 feet that might not sound like much to anyone else. But to me, it was everything. It meant the oak stumps were no accident. It meant the zigzag fence wasn't sloppy workmanship. It meant every smirk, every laugh, every time he'd called me old man, had been part of a plan. I drove to the county clerk's office the next morning, deed and survey in hand. The building smelled of paper and stale coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The young woman behind the counter looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Sir, if he's filed, you'll get a hearing date in the mail," she said without looking up. "How long?" I asked. She clicked around on her computer. "Could be 2 months, sometimes 3. Depends on the backlog." 2 months, I repeated, disbelief coating my voice. What's to stop him from tearing down more of my land in the meantime? She shrugged, already reaching for the next file. "That's between you and your neighbor. Just bring your records when the hearing date comes." Between me and my neighbor, as if it was a little squabble over a hedge instead of a theft of 30 years of sweat and sacrifice. I walked out into the blazing sun, deed crumpled in my fist, and knew Greg was counting on exactly this. He knew the system was slow. He knew he could do whatever he wanted while the county shuffled papers. And sure enough, when I pulled back into my driveway, there it was, a brand new for sale sign hammered just inside the disputed line, bold red letters catching the light. Greg stood behind it, arms folded, smirk plastered on his face. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, slamming my truck door. "Future lot," he said, casual as if he were commenting on the weather. "Thinking of subdividing. Could fetch a nice price. Young families are looking for land out here. Be good for the neighborhood." My fists clenched. "You don't own it." He tilted his head, that smug grin widening. "Not yet. But I will. And when I do, everyone will already be used to seeing it as mine. Perception's half the battle, old man." I stared at the sign, its metal post speared into ground I had cleared with Maria 30 years ago. I saw her in my memory, laughing as she helped me plant grass seed along that line, hands dirty but eyes bright. That patch had been ours, not his, not anyone else's. Ours. Greg had no right, but in his mind, he already did. The next week confirmed it. Word spread faster than wildfire in town. At the diner, I overheard Greg holding court at the counter, boasting loud enough for the whole place to hear. Old Flores never knew where his land ended. Been mowing half my side for years. Hell, I'm doing him a favor straightening it out. Sheriff will back me up, you'll see. The men around him laughed, one even slapping him on the back. My stomach twisted. I wanted to stand up, to shout the truth. But I knew how small towns worked. Once a rumor started, it stuck like mud. Later, at the hardware store, I caught him in the lumber aisle. "Keep my name out of your mouth," I said, voice low and tight. Greg leaned against his cart, arms crossed. "Relax. Just letting folks know what's coming. They'll thank me when I sell that lot and new people move in. Better neighbors than you, anyway." "You're a liar," I shot back. He smirked. "And you're a bitter old man clinging to dirt you can't even use. Maybe I'll build a garage there, or a pool, something nice." I walked away before I did something I'd regret. But my hands trembled with rage the whole drive home. It wasn't just Greg anymore. It was his whole family. His boys tossed their football into my yard on purpose, laughing when I didn't throw it back. One afternoon, I caught them dragging lawn chairs onto my grass, planting themselves right by my garden beds. "Get off my land," I barked. One of them, the taller one, just smirked. "Dad says it's ours now. You're just squatting." The arrogance in his voice made my blood run cold. Children repeating their father's lies, treating them like gospel. I looked him in the eye and said, "Your dad is a liar, and liars always pay." He laughed, but his eyes flickered with doubt before he turned away. Kids know when they're repeating poison, even if they don't admit it. The hostility turned personal in ways I hadn't expected. One August afternoon, Tammy strutted up to the mailbox while I collected mine. Her sunglasses caught the sun, her lips painted into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "You should think about selling," she said sweetly. "Would save you the trouble. Greg and I could take the whole parcel, give you a nice payout. That way, you don't embarrass yourself fighting a losing battle." I stared at her. "I'm not selling, not to you, not to anyone." Her smile sharpened. "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised when the sheriff comes knocking with papers that say otherwise. Nobody wants to see an old man dragged through court, especially when he doesn't have much time left." Her words cut deeper than any fence post. To her, I wasn't a neighbor. I wasn't even a man. I was just a speed bump on her road to more land. I spent that night at my kitchen table, the deed spread before me. My old mortgage papers, Maria's handwriting in the margins of our early budget notes. Every line, every dollar, every sacrifice screamed that this land was ours, not theirs. When dawn broke, I realized something. Greg and Tammy weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were thieves. And they were winning, at least in the eyes of the town. 2 days later, the breaking point came. I came home from the store to find Greg on a riding mower, cutting deep lines into my grass inside the disputed area. His boys followed, tossing seed as if it were their own yard. I stormed toward him. "Get off my land." He killed the engine, leaned back in the seat, and looked me dead in the eye. His grin was slow, deliberate. "Not your land anymore, old man. Just accept it." "It's not yours?" He raised his beer, the one he'd been sipping even as he mowed. His voice carried across the yard, loud enough for his wife and kids to hear. "Too bad, old man. It's ours now." The words hung in the hot summer air like a brand, searing themselves into me. Tammy's laugh followed, shrill and cruel, echoing off the trees. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just turned and walked back to my house, fists tight, chest burning. They thought I was retreating. They thought they'd broken me. But on my desk lay a manila folder I'd already begun to fill. 30 years of tax receipts, mortgage records, photographs of Maria and me building the place board by board. The original survey map, my name printed bold across the top. Proof, undeniable proof. Greg Jenkins thought he'd beaten me. What he didn't know was that in my silence, I was sharpening my knife. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The morning it all broke, the air was heavy with humidity, thick enough that even the cicadas seemed to complain. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, and froze. Where my last 2 oaks had stood tall and proud, only stumps remained. Fresh cuts gleamed white in the rising sun, sap bleeding like wounds. Branches lay scattered across my yard, sawdust mixing with dew on the grass. My chest hollowed out. Those trees had been Maria's favorite. We used to sit under them in the evenings, her head resting on my shoulder while the kids played tag in the shade. When she was sick, she asked me to hang her wind chimes from their branches so she could hear them from her bed. The chimes lay twisted in the sawdust now, their soft music silenced forever. I dropped the mug. Coffee splattered across the porch, but I didn't feel the heat. My hands shook as I staggered toward the fence line. And there they were, Greg and his 2 sons, grinning like wolves. Chainsaws still buzzed in their hands. "Morning, old man," Greg called. "Don't thank us all at once. We saved you the trouble." I stared at the stumps, at the lifeless chimes in the dirt. "Those were mine," I said, voice raw. "Correction," Greg said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "They were in my yard. Had to come down. Safety hazard. They weren't in your yard. You know that." His smirk widened. "Too bad. They are now." His boys laughed, high and cruel. Something cracked inside me. 30 years of memories. Christmas mornings, birthday parties under those branches, Maria's voice carried in the wind. Shredded by a man who saw my life as an inconvenience. I wanted to lunge across the line, to rip the chainsaw from his hands and shove him against the stumps he'd left behind. But I forced myself still. Because if I moved now, I'd be the one hauled away. Greg leaned on his saw, eyes glinting. "Get used to it. The world changes, old man. You can't hang on to everything forever." I turned without another word. Because if I stayed, I'd bury that saw in his smirk. Behind me, Tammy's voice cut across the air like a blade. "Don't pout. We'll plant some nice bushes. Make it look pretty." I shut the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Inside, my house felt suffocating. I pressed my palms against the kitchen counter, head down, breathing like I'd just run a mile. The smell of fresh sawdust wafted through the open window, sickly sweet. I slammed it shut. The next day, I found the word "ours" spray-painted in red across the side of my shed. Letters dripped down the weathered boards like blood, stark against the wood I'd nailed in place 30 years ago. My stomach twisted as I ran my hand over it. The shed had been my sanctuary. Maria used to tease me about hiding in there when life got loud, tools neatly lined on hooks, old radio humming as I tinkered. It was the one place that always felt like mine. Now it was branded like cattle. I stormed across the yard, paint still fresh on my fingers, and found Greg lounging on his porch, beer in hand. Tammy scrolled her phone beside him, her sunglasses reflecting the sun. "Your kids did this," I said, voice sharp as glass. Greg tilted his head. "Got proof?" "The paint's still wet," he shrugged. "Could have been anyone. Maybe you did it yourself. Wouldn't surprise me." My jaw clenched. "You're pushing too far." Tammy lowered her sunglasses just enough for me to see her eyes glitter. "Maybe the universe is just correcting itself. Maybe it's not really yours anymore." Her words chilled me more than the vandalism. They weren't just stealing land. They were trying to erase me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair, Maria's photograph on the mantel, watching me. She looked so alive in that picture, her smile soft, her eyes bright. I whispered to her like a madman in the dark. I won't let them take it, Maria. I promise. They'll pay for this. The next week brought another insult. I came home from town to find Greg's mower carving wide arcs across my grass, his boys tossing seed in the churned dirt like they were blessing their new kingdom. I stormed toward him. "Get off my land." He killed the engine and leaned back, beer in one hand, smirk plastered on his face. "Not your land anymore, old man. Just accept it. It's not yours." He raised his beer in a mock toast, his voice carrying across the yard. "Too bad, old man. It's ours now." The boys laughed. Tammy clapped her hands like it was a show. My vision tunneled. For a moment, all I saw was Maria's face overlaying Greg's smirk, her wind chimes broken at his feet, her shed defaced by his lies. I turned and walked back to my house without another word. Behind me, their laughter echoed like nails on glass. They thought I was beaten. They thought my silence meant surrender. But inside, a different fire burned. On my desk lay a manila folder I had started filling days earlier. 30 years of tax receipts, mortgage statements, old photographs of Maria and me planting those oaks with our children at our feet. The original survey, yellowed but clear, my name bold across the top. Proof, undeniable proof. I pulled the folder closer. If they wanted war, I'd give them war. But I wouldn't fight it with chainsaws or spray paint. I'd fight it with paper, with law, with truth that they couldn't twist. Greg thought he was clever, filing his paperwork and spreading lies. He thought I was just an old man too tired to fight. But he'd forgotten one thing. I built this land from nothing, and I wasn't about to let a thief erase 30 years of my life. That night, I called an old friend, a lawyer named Harris I hadn't spoken to in years. His voice crackled through the line, surprised to hear from me. "Dennis, been a long time." "I need help," I said simply. "It's about my land." By the time I hung up, the fire inside me had settled into something colder, sharper, a blade instead of a flame. The Jenkins thought they'd humiliated me. What they didn't know was that every insult, every laugh, every tree they cut had only sharpened my resolve. The breaking point had come and gone. Now came the reckoning. Harris was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. When I met him at his office the following Monday, he leaned back in his chair, glasses sliding down his nose as he scanned the stack of documents I'd hauled in. 30 years of receipts, surveys, tax payments, he murmured, tapping each page with his pen. "You've been thorough, Dennis." "I had to be," I said. "This land's all I've got left. They're not taking it." He nodded slowly, flipping to the yellowed survey map I'd kept tucked in my filing cabinet all those years. "This is gold. As long as the county's copy matches, we'll bury him." "Greg filed a property line adjustment," I reminded him. "He's already telling the whole town it's his." Harris smirked. "Let him talk. Arrogance is a gift. The louder he brags, the harder he'll fall when the truth comes out." That was the first time I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Not much, but enough to breathe. Over the next 2 weeks, Harris and I worked quietly. I dug through every box in my attic, every drawer in my shed. I found photos from the day Maria and I moved in. Her holding a potted fern, me standing by the original fence posts, smiling like a younger, stronger version of myself. The markers were clear in the pictures, bright metal stakes poking from the ground right where I'd always said they were. I found another photo from my daughter's 8th birthday. The kids were playing under the oaks, balloons tied to the branches, the fence line visible in the background. Proof, frozen in time. Proof the Jenkins couldn't erase no matter how many chainsaws they fired up. Meanwhile, Harris hired a licensed surveyor to re-examine the property. I walked the line with him, watching as he drove stakes into the dirt, his measuring equipment humming. When he finished, he gave a low whistle. "Your neighbor's way over," he said, pointing to where Greg had cemented the new posts. 4 feet clear as day. Anybody with eyes can see it. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Make sure that's in writing." "You'll have it tomorrow," he promised. While we worked, the Jenkins doubled down on their arrogance. Greg's mower roared across my land nearly every other day, his boys whooping as they kicked up dirt. Tammy strutted around in wide sunglasses, waving at passing cars as if she owned half the county. And every time they saw me, Greg couldn't resist a jab. "Morning, old man," he'd call, raising his beer. "Enjoy your yard while it lasts." Sometimes he'd add, "Hope you're saving up for court. Gonna cost you more than it's worth." I said nothing, just nodded like I'd accepted defeat. The truth was sweeter than honey. Every word he spoke, every laugh he barked, was another step into the noose he was tying around his own neck. Harris told me to document everything. So I did. I kept a small notebook in my pocket, jotting down dates, times, and what I saw. August 12th, Greg mowing. August 16th, spray paint still visible, unshed. August 20th, Tammy offered to buy whole parcel, said sheriff would drag me out. Each entry was another nail in their coffin. One evening, I even filmed Greg as he shouted across the line. He was drunk, voice slurred, but clear enough for the camera. "Doesn't matter what paper you've got, old man. Everyone knows it's mine. Too bad, so sad." His boys howled in the background. When I showed the clip to Harris, he smiled. "This is beautiful. Judges hate arrogance. You just gave me a hammer to swing." The surveyor's report came in a week later, crisp and official. Every measurement confirmed my line was accurate. Greg's posts an illegal encroachment. Harris filed it with the county alongside my deed and photographs. The hearing date was set. 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. That was the time Greg had left to play king before I tore his crown off. In the meantime, I laid my own quiet groundwork. I called my daughter, Sarah, who lived 2 hours away. "Bring the kids this weekend," I told her. "I want them to see the place. Might be the last time it looks this way." She didn't understand at first, but when she arrived, I walked her along the fence. I showed her the spray paint, the stumps, the crooked posts. Her face hardened. "They can't do this," she said. "They already are," I replied. Her husband, Mark, took photos with his phone. Dozens of angles, wide shots, close-ups of the concrete in the post holes. "If you need me to testify," he said, "I'll be there." That meant more to me than he knew. For months, I'd felt like the whole town believed Greg's lies. But now I had allies. People who'd stand beside me when the time came. As summer slipped toward fall, I kept up the act. I mowed my half of the yard, careful not to touch the line he'd claimed. I nodded when he jeered, turned away when Tammy laughed. To them, I looked like a broken man waiting for the county to roll over me. But at night, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the evidence glowing under the lamp. Maria's wind chimes, now hanging by my window, sang in the evening breeze. Each note was a reminder. Patience. Justice comes to those who prepare. The Jenkins never saw me visiting the courthouse, never saw me speaking to Harris, never saw the stack of affidavits building in my folder. They thought silence meant surrender. One evening, I overheard Greg at the gas station, boasting to another man at the pump. 6 weeks and it's mine. Old man doesn't stand a chance. Tammy's already talking about building a pool. I filled my tank, paid, and left without a word. But inside, I was smiling. Because in 6 weeks, Greg Jenkins was going to learn what it felt like to choke on his own arrogance. By September, Harris had everything ready. "You've got him dead to rights," he told me, sliding the folder back across the desk. "But don't let up. Keep documenting, keep quiet. Let him dig his own grave." I nodded, gripping the folder tight. He'll never see it coming. That night, I sat on my porch as the sun sank behind the hills. The Jenkins were out again, laughing, drinking, their music pounding across the line. Greg spotted me, raised his beer, and shouted, "Hope you're ready for court, old man. Hope your wallet's fat." Tammy's laugh cut through the dusk like a blade. I raised my own glass of iced tea, smiled, and nodded. Because what Greg didn't know was that the sheriff himself would soon be standing on his porch, papers in hand. The Jenkins thought they were untouchable, but every empire falls, and theirs was already crumbling. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The walls held stories of men and women who thought they could twist the law, only to learn it had teeth. I sat at the long oak table beside Harris, my folder of documents stacked neatly between us. Across the room, Greg swaggered in like he owned the place, Tammy clacking behind him in her high heels, sunglasses perched on her head, even indoors. Their boys slouched against the wall, smirking like they were here to watch a comedy. Greg spotted me and grinned. "Didn't think you'd show, old man. Thought you'd crawl back under your porch and give up." I didn't answer. Harris leaned over and whispered, "Let him talk. He's digging." The judge entered, gavel striking once. The room quieted. My heart thudded steady in my chest, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel weak. I felt ready. Greg opened his case first, since he was the one who filed the adjustment. He strutted to the front, papers in hand, and began his performance. "Your Honor, my family and I purchased our property last year. Upon moving in, we discovered that the neighbor, Mr. Flores here, had been encroaching onto our land for decades. The fence line was crooked, the trees overhung. His shed sat suspiciously close to the boundary. I'm simply asking the county to correct a long-standing error." He spoke smoothly, confidence dripping from every word. Tammy nodded along, arms crossed, lips pursed like she was already victorious. Their boys chuckled when Greg threw in, "It's not his fault. He's just been confused for 30 years. Happens with age." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have evidence?" Greg handed over a map, an amateur drawing he'd sketched himself, red lines where he claimed the property should be. No survey, no official record, just his words scribbled in ink. The judge examined it briefly, then looked to Harris. "Mr. Flores, your response?" Harris stood smoothly, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, my client has lived on his land for 3 decades. He has paid taxes on every inch, maintained it, and has documentation to prove it. May I present Exhibit A?" He laid out the original deed, crisp despite its age. My name glared up from the page in bold letters. "Exhibit B," Harris continued, sliding forward the county's archived survey, the exact same map I'd found in my files. "The boundaries are clear and unchanged since purchase." The judge's eyes flicked over the papers. Already I saw the Jenkins smirks falter. Harris wasn't done. He pulled photo after photo from the folder. Maria and me planting oaks along the line, kids playing birthday games under their branches, the original fence posts visible in the background. "These photos date back nearly 30 years, he said. "They clearly show the property line as it has always stood." Tammy shifted uncomfortably. Greg's jaw tightened, but he still forced a smirk. "And finally, Exhibit C," Harris said, handing over the surveyor's report. "An independent survey conducted last month confirms that Mr. Jenkins has moved the fence 4 feet into my client's property. The posts are cemented illegally on Mr. Flores' land." The judge read silently for a long moment. Greg's smirk wavered, but Harris wasn't finished. "If I may, Your Honor, one more piece of evidence." He nodded to me, and I set a small recorder on the table. Harris pressed play. Greg's drunken voice filled the quiet courtroom. "Doesn't matter what paper you've got, old man. Everyone knows it's mine. Too bad. So sad." Laughter followed, the unmistakable sound of his son's. The judge's brow furrowed. "Mr. Jenkins, is that your voice?" Greg's face flushed crimson. He stammered, That's taken out of context, just a joke." The judge didn't look convinced. Harris folded his hands calmly. "A joke doesn't involve filing false claims with the county, cutting down trees, or spray painting ours on another man's shed. I have dated photographs of the vandalism as well." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Greg shot me a look that could have killed. Tammy whispered something sharp under her breath, her face pale now behind the mask of makeup. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Jenkins, you've offered no official documents to support your claim. Meanwhile, Mr. Flores has provided deeds, surveys, photographs, witness statements, and a professional report. Your claim is not only unsupported, but appears to be malicious." Greg's smirk was gone entirely now. His fists clenched at his sides, Tammy tugging at his sleeve. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court rules that the property line stands as it has for 30 years. Mr. Jenkins is ordered to remove his encroaching fence posts immediately at his own expense. Additionally, restitution for damages, including the felled trees and vandalized shed, will be determined in a separate hearing." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Silence hung heavy for a moment. Then the murmurs began. I stood slowly, my legs steady beneath me. For the first time in months, I felt tall again. Greg spun toward me, face red with fury. "This isn't over, old man," he hissed. I leaned close enough for only him to hear. "Oh, it's over. You just don't know it yet." Tammy grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the door, her sunglasses slipping from her head. Their boys trailed behind, no longer smirking. Harris clapped me on the shoulder. "That," he said, "was a clean kill." But he was wrong. It wasn't over yet. The judge's ruling was only the beginning. Greg Jenkins hadn't just lost a boundary line. He'd set himself on a path that would strip him of far more than 4 feet of dirt. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the autumn air crisp in my lungs, I knew the trap had sprung. Now came the fall. The day after the hearing, I woke to silence. No mower growling across the grass, no boys hollering from the fence, no Tammy's shrieking laughter into the air. Just the wind, the birds, and the quiet hum of my own land breathing again. For the first time in months, I drank my coffee in peace. But I knew it wouldn't last. Greg Jenkins wasn't the kind of man to swallow defeat gracefully. By the end of the week, the court order arrived at his house. The fence posts had to be removed within 30 days, and he was responsible for the costs. I watched from my porch as a deputy handed him the envelope. Greg tore it open, read the words, and turned beet red. He crumpled the paper in his fist and hurled it across the yard. Later that afternoon, I found him with a sledgehammer, smashing the cement around the posts he'd poured so smugly weeks before. His boys stood awkwardly nearby, no longer laughing, helping him drag the broken posts out like prisoners hauling chains. Tammy sat on a lawn chair, sunglasses hiding her eyes, pretending it wasn't happening. Each clang of the hammer was music to me. Every post ripped from the ground was another piece of my land reclaimed. But the fence was just the beginning. 2 weeks later came the restitution hearing. Harris and I walked into court calm, papers in hand. Greg came in late, jaw tight, Tammy trailing behind him with a forced smile. The judge didn't waste time. "Mr. Jenkins, you are hereby ordered to compensate Mr. Flores for damages caused to his property, including the removal of mature oak trees and vandalism of his shed. The total assessed value is $48,000, Greg's eyes bulged. $48,000 for a couple of trees. The judge's gavel struck once. Trees of that age are irreplaceable. You destroyed property that carried value beyond lumber. Pay the amount or face a lien. Tammy gasped. Greg slammed his hand against the table. This is robbery. But no one listened. The ruling was final. When we walked out of the courthouse, Harris grinned. He can't cover that, not with the mortgage they've got. He was right. By the next month, whispers ran through town. Greg had missed a payment. Tammy was calling relatives, asking for short-term loans. Their once flashy party stopped. The shiny new truck disappeared from the driveway. I'd see Greg in town sometimes, shoulders hunched now, muttering under his breath when people asked about the case. He still tried to bluff. Still told a few folks the judge was wrong, that he'd appeal. But the laughter in his voice was gone. The smirk had dried up. Meanwhile, the deputy came again, this time with papers for a lien. Without payment, the bank would seize assets. Greg's empire of arrogance was crumbling brick by brick. Tammy wasn't handling it any better. One afternoon, I caught her at the grocery store, whispering fiercely into her phone. "No, I told you. We need the money now. He promised this would work. Don't hang up." She noticed me nearby and turned away, face flushed, sunglasses slipping. For me, every day grew sweeter. I tended my garden, mowed my grass, and rebuilt the shed, painting over the red scars of ours. With each brushstroke, I reclaimed what was mine. Maria's wind chimes hung again by the porch, tinkling in the autumn breeze. But the Jenkins yard grew quieter. No mower, no music. Just arguments that carried across the line when windows were left open. Tammy's sharp voice, Greg's growls, doors slamming late into the night. By November, foreclosure notices were taped to their door. Big, ugly letters, final warning. Greg tried tearing them down, but everyone saw. The mailman, the neighbors passing on the road. Me, sitting on my porch with my coffee. The gossip at the diner shifted. No one believed Greg anymore. The same men who once slapped his back now shook their heads. Shouldn't have picked a fight he couldn't win, they muttered. And still, Greg tried to save face. He stood in his driveway one Saturday, shouting across to me, "This isn't over, old man. You just wait." His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee and let the silence eat him alive. 2 weeks later, the sheriff's cruiser pulled into their driveway. I stood on my porch, watching as the deputy handed Greg one last envelope. Greg ripped it open, his face draining of color. Tammy came running out, her voice rising into a wail. The sheriff stepped forward, his tone firm. I couldn't hear every word, but I knew enough. Foreclosure was final. They had 30 days to vacate. 30 days before the house wasn't theirs anymore. Greg slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. Tammy collapsed on the porch steps, her head in her hands. Their boys lingered in the yard, faces pale, no smirks left. I turned back into my house, the wind chimes singing softly behind me. They had tried to take my land, my trees, my memories. Instead, they had lost everything. But I wasn't done watching yet. Because in 30 days, the sheriff wouldn't just be delivering papers. He'd be delivering eviction. And I planned to be right there when Greg Jenkins walked out of the house he thought he could steal from me. The 30 days crawled by, each one quieter than the last. The Jenkins' once bustling yard, where chainsaws had buzzed and laughter had mocked, now sat still. No mower cut across my grass. No music spilled from their porch. Just the low hum of arguments through thin walls and the occasional slamming of doors. I almost pitied them. Almost. On the 30th morning, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up their driveway. I was already on my porch, coffee in hand, waiting. The air was sharp with winter, the kind of cold that bit through clothes and made the world feel brittle. Deputy Collins stepped out, papers in hand. He was a man of few words, the kind who didn't enjoy evictions, but did his duty all the same. He knocked firmly on their door. Greg answered, jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot. He already looked like a man defeated. Tammy hovered behind him, her sunglasses gone, makeup streaked from too many tears. The boys stood further back, duffel bags at their feet. "Mr. Jenkins," the deputy said, voice steady, "this property has been foreclosed. You've been given ample notice. It's time to vacate." Greg's fists tightened. "This is theft. I built this place up. You can't just—" Collins cut him off. "You had your day in court. This is final." I watched as the sheriff gestured toward the yard. Movers rolled in behind him, men in uniforms carrying boxes, loading them into a truck. Each item hauled out was another nail in Greg's coffin. Tammy tried to grab a lamp from one man's hands, shouting, "That's mine!" But he brushed past her. The law didn't care about tantrums. Greg stormed onto the porch, spotting me across the fence. His face twisted, red with rage and humiliation. "You did this," he spat. I stood, calm as the morning sky. "No, Greg, you did this. You tried to steal what wasn't yours, and the law doesn't side with thieves." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For once, he had no comeback, no smirk, no cruel laugh. Just silence. Tammy broke it with a sob. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands covering her face. The boys dragged their bags down the driveway, their shoulders slumped, no fight left in them. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at anyone. The movers worked fast. In less than an hour, the house stood empty. Curtains fluttered in the winter wind, doors left ajar, the hollow sound of footsteps echoing inside. The Jenkins stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at what was no longer theirs. Deputy Collins handed Greg one last envelope. "Bank has repossessed. You're trespassing if you step back inside. I suggest you leave peacefully." Greg snatched the paper, crumpled it in his fist, and hurled it onto the ground. His chest rose and fell like a man choking on air. He turned one last time toward me, eyes burning. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I shook my head. "No, Greg. You already do." They piled into a beat-up sedan I hadn't seen before. The shiny truck was long gone, repossessed weeks earlier. Tammy slammed the door, her tears hidden behind a hard mask. The engine sputtered, then caught. They drove off without looking back. And just like that, the Jenkins were gone. I sat back on my porch, the wind chimes Maria had loved so much singing gently above me. The land stretched out before me, quiet, unbroken, mine. For months I'd lived under siege. For months I'd been mocked, stolen from, treated like a ghost in my own home. Now, the silence was victory. That evening, I walked the property line. The ground was scarred where Greg had poured his cement, but it was my scar to heal. The oaks were gone, but I touched the stumps gently and whispered a promise. I'd plant new trees come spring, stronger ones. When I reached the shed, the red spray paint was still faintly visible under the new coat of paint. Ours, they had scrawled. I traced the letters with my fingers, then smiled. Yes, ours. Mine and Maria's. Always had been. Always would be. I sat on the porch that night with a glass of whiskey, the stars sharp above. For the first time since the Jenkins moved in, I felt Maria's presence beside me, soft and steady. I imagined her smile, the way she would have laughed at Greg's arrogance, the way she would have said, "You showed them who really belongs here." It wasn't just revenge I'd won. It was dignity. It was justice. The Jenkins lost their house, their money, their pride. But me? I kept my land, my memories, my peace. Sometimes justice doesn't come fast. Sometimes it takes patience, silence, and the right moment to strike. But when it comes hard. And as I raised my glass to the night sky, I whispered, "Rest easy, Maria. We won. The Jenkins are evicted, left in humiliation and ruin. The MC stands firm, reclaiming peace and honoring Maria. Revenge is complete. But so is healing. If you like this story, subscribe and tell us about your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next one, click on the box on the screen.